This is Homefront Ethanol, and I've got a good one for you guys today. This thing is finally starting to take shape, starting to look like a real still, and I'm gonna show you guys exactly how I did it. Stay tuned. Right now, I'm cutting the slot for the alcohol collection plate. This is the piece of copper I'm gonna be cutting it out of. I'm gonna be cutting it using a hacksaw, and I have this wooden dowel that I turned into a jig that's gonna assist me in cutting through this copper. Let me show you guys. Put some WD-40 on the blade. This jig is pretty good for holding the saw, but I still have to eyeball the angle pretty much, but I think I can get it. Once you get it started, it's a lot easier. This will hopefully explain why I'm building it this way and how I'm determining where to cut this slot. This is the condenser that we made earlier. It's gonna fit inside this section of pipe, which is gonna fit with the fitting on this section of pipe. So the condenser is gonna sit around about here inside this pipe. The condenser's job is to be cold and to have condensation build up on it. And that condensation is all the alcohol that we want in the first place. So as that alcohol condenses, it's gonna drip downward. Usually when people build these stills, they cut 2 notches and install 2 pieces of copper. Those 2 pieces of copper make up a ramp and a trough. The alcohol condensation drips off of this condenser and flows off of the ramp and is caught by the trough. At the bottom of the trough is the alcohol takeoff point, and that's where we're gonna get our actual product from. My design is a little bit different. I'm only cutting a slot for the trough. For me, in my still, my ramp is gonna be soldered to the bottom of this condenser. It's just gonna be a small piece of copper that's gonna act like a gutter and is gonna flow most of it into the trough. So I'm only cutting 1 notch for this, which is a heck of a lot easier to do, and I think it's gonna be a lot easier to clean. I've got the notch cut in this piece of column. I cut it a little bit less than halfway through the pipe, and my sheet of copper fits beautifully into that notch. That is gonna solder up really nice. And hopefully now you guys can understand what I was meaning a second ago about how this is gonna be basically a puddle for the alcohol to pool up into, and our takeoff point is gonna be right there. So I need to cut this out and prep everything for solder. I traced this line with a Sharpie off of the piece of pipe, and I'm gonna be cutting it with the hacksaw. That hacksaw was way too slow, so I've got out the multi-tool with a wood and nail blade. This is what I was able to do with the first pass with that multi-tool. This thing is hot. But now I'm gonna clamp it onto this and remove all of these edges that I can. But I'm still gonna leave the line. I'll get to it. This is the piece I got from cutting it out of the sheet with the multi-tool, and it fits right into this slot. And I'm gonna be removing that jagged edge with some 60 grit sandpaper. I've got the alcohol collection plate prepped for solder. We're going to be doing our soldering in the dark tonight. Hope you guys can see that. It's a full moon out tonight. It's really nice out. Got my solder right here. Just waiting for this to heat up. There we go. Soldering up. Got to make sure all around the slot it gets hot solder. Just like that, I think we've got it. This is what it looks like after the soldering is done. It's still very hot. There's a seam all along where that alcohol collection plate solders in. If you look at it from inside the pipe, the solder did its job. Got everywhere where it needed to go. There we go. That tube needs to be cleaned out, but other than that, we got a good solder joint and a good alcohol collection plate. This is the piece of column that I installed the alcohol collection plate into. And as you guys can see, I put a little crosshatch here. That is where our takeoff point is going to be. The takeoff point is going to be a piece of 3/8 inch copper that attaches to the needle valve, and that's going to be how we control the still. And that line is going to continue that way down to the ground. So instead of drilling this hole perpendicular and bending the line to return to the ground, I'm going to drill this hole at a 45-degree angle so that I have to bend the line less. How I'm going to accomplish that is I've drilled a 3/8 inch hole in this piece of wood, and I'm going to attach this piece of wood to the piece of column and drill the hole like that. And for that, I've got these zip ties, and once I get it right where I want it, I'm going to tape it down. Change of plan because that didn't work. I'm going to drill a much smaller hole that's perpendicular, and that's going to act as a pilot hole so that when I go to drill it with this, the drill bit doesn't skip around. There we go. I'm going to gauge this hole up to 5/16 so that when I go to drill with my 3/8, I'm not so much removing a lot of material, but really just getting the angle right. This is still the 5/16 tip. I'm just going to put this in here and then freehand get my 45-degree angle. I think that did it. I ditched the jig because it wasn't really helping, and I'd rather just freehand it and be able to see what I'm doing. So this is the 3/8 inch drill bit. Turned out pretty nice. All right, moment of truth. Did I ruin this piece or is it gonna work? Here's our 3/8 inch line. Looks pretty good to me. I'm happy with that. All right, so here's the hole I drilled for our takeoff point. As you guys can see, it's a little bit rough. There's some deformations in the copper pipe. There's a lip right here. And these are some gouges from where I tried to drill it with the jig originally. I'm gonna sand this lip off. I'm gonna hammer out any deformations in the copper. And I'm eventually gonna get this hot and solder it so you're not even gonna be able to see those gouges right there. But what's important is when we put in our line, it's a tight fit and there's no gaps. So that's gonna solder up really nicely. I'm doing a dry fit right now just to see how it's gonna look. This is a piece of 3/8 inch line. I just put a slight bend in. And as you guys can see, I fixed the part in the column that had gouges in it from the drill bit, just with some solder. Before I solder these two together, I've got to prep both sides, and how I'm gonna do that is I've got a piece of sandpaper here. I'm gonna roll up and use it as a little file to get the inside of this hole nice and clean. And after that, I'm gonna flux both sides and I'll show you guys how it solders together. We're down to the fun part. You guys know the drill. Pretty sure that did it. This piece soldered on really nicely. I'm happy with how it turned out. The next part that has to go on is this 3/8 inch needle valve, and it's a compression fitting. So I've got mama crescent wrench and baby crescent wrench. The alcohol collection plate and takeoff point are both finished. So the next thing I'm gonna do is solder this piece to this piece with this 1 5/8" coupling. This piece is just for spacing. So this condenser is gonna fit inside the column, and this spout at the end of the condenser is gonna funnel all of that condensation right into our alcohol collection plate. So I'm gonna sand both these sides with this 400 grit sandpaper and apply flux, and I'll show you guys how it solders up. All right, we're down to the fun part. I've got this column angled downwards so that any extra solder doesn't end up in our alcohol collection point. That got it. This is the piece we just made. The next thing that's gonna happen is that is gonna solder onto our existing column. So this end is gonna screw onto the lid, which attaches to the pot, and on the opposite end, the condenser is gonna sit, and we have our takeoff point. So let's look at the tape real quick. This whole column is about 78 inches long, 6'6". But the measurement that matters when you're making these columns is the length of the packed column. This is our takeoff point. So the whole column going that way is going to be filled with a copper mesh that's also called packing. That copper packing increases the purity of distillation by increasing the number of theoretical plates in the column. I'll probably explain that more later, but what I wanted to show you guys now is that the length of our packed column is about 65 inches. What I'm gonna do now is prep these two sides, and I'll show you guys how it solders up. I couldn't get this fitting onto this piece of pipe, and usually when that happens, I put the piece of pipe in the freezer, but I couldn't do that because this piece is so long. So this is a cold pack wrapped in some painter's plastic with a zip tie around it. And hopefully in a couple minutes, I'll be able to fit this fitting onto the piece of pipe. I hope this works. It's also raining. Nice. That did work. This piece is ready to solder up. think that got it. I'm about to straighten out the rest of this 3/8 line. It's gonna plug into the other side of our needle valve. I'm gonna use these clamps, some Milwaukee vice grips, and a hammer. I'll show you guys how. The first thing I'm gonna do is just straighten out this coil as best as I can by hand. Now that the line is somewhat straight, I'm gonna flatten each end out with the hammer. I clamped this crimped end to my tailgate as tight as I could. I've got these Milwaukee vice grips on this end as tight as possible. It's clamped on the other end. I'm gonna pull with this hand and I'm gonna hit with my other hand. Just like that. Pliers almost came off, but in the process, this line just got completely straightened out. That's really nice. After I straightened out that 3/8 inch line, I cut a piece that is the same length as this valve to the end of the column, and that's going to install into this compression fitting. All right, you guys, our column for the still is complete. This is a column holder that I made out of some 2x6 because this thing got too tall to stand on its own. But here is where our condenser is gonna sit. Here's our alcohol collection plate and our takeoff point. Here's our needle valve, and this is where the product is gonna flow downward. This came from the original Vevor still. I cut the hole in the top of this to accept the column. The only things left to do are to make and install the heating and cooling system, and I've also got to pack this column with our copper mesh. But other than that, I am really happy with how this thing came out. It looks great. I really like the column holder. I hope you guys had as much fun watching this video as I did making it. And until next time, this is Homefront Ethanol. You guys have a good one.